room. We are conducting a Google Hangout today with two of our top columnists, Scott Ostler, a longtime contributor to the Sporting Green, and Killion, one of our top NFL columnists, and basically covers everything for us here at the Chronicle. A lot of topics to talk about. It's the thick of the pennant race, but the NFL is front and center nationally, as always, and not only for the activities on the field, now that we've gone through 2 weeks of the NFL season, but we also have an endless amount of storylines off the field. Domestic abuse is at the front of that line, with the videotape from Ray Rice breaking big 2 weeks ago and putting the whole NFL under a spotlight. And here in San Francisco, the 49ers have been under their own spotlight, with defensive tackle Ray McDonald under investigation for alleged domestic abuse of his fiancée. Let me start with Ann Killion. Ann, interesting news today. Despite all the bad press surrounding the NFL right now, the Niners-Bears game got the highest TV ratings of any Sunday night game in the history of NBC on the West Coast. So is it that people don't care about this, Ann?
No, I think people do care about it. I don't ever judge ratings as meaning that people don't care about an issue. I mean, I think, to ask someone to turn off a sport that they really like out of protest is kind of silly. I think the people who can bring the most pressure on the NFL are its actual fans, and I think the fact that people are talking about this so much that there's a lot of discussion among fans on social media, and now today it's reached to the sponsors. I think that's where the pressure comes. People are not going to leave the NFL in droves. Just like, even if they were upset about steroids, they weren't going to turn off baseball in droves. They just were going to, make their views known about it.
That's a great point. Let me throw it over to Scott Ostler for comment here. Ann mentioned that some of the sponsors have started to complain. Anheuser-Busch was probably the biggest name today that I saw in the various wire reports, starting to question the NFL on its off-field policies, asking the league to be a little more attentive to the actions of its players. Scott, do you see a day that sponsors could leave the NFL?
Yeah, I think it's already, in a very small way, it's started. There's a lot of people talking about that. I was watching TV last night, and they were talking to Rich, the Carolina coach, and he had a backdrop behind him. Anytime we talk to these coaches, there's a backdrop behind him, and it's usually a sponsor. And his was, I think, Marriott Hotels. And when the interview was over, they went. The announcer who was pointed out that Marriott had just pulled its sponsorship from the Carolina Cougars. And anytime you see one of their interviews now, you won't see the Marriott backdrop. Now that might be a small thing to them, and maybe they can say, okay, we can take that hit, that's no big deal. But that starts a wave, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that. There's too many companies that are just going to say, look, we look at these pictures of these women being beat up, we look at the pictures of these kids that look like they were thrown out of a moving car or something, they were so beat up by their dad, and we just can't sponsor an organization that doesn't try to get in front of this. So I think, yeah, there will be a lot more of that.
Thanks, Scott. I think that's some pretty good perspective on the sponsorship environment, and I think there's some truth in from what both of you said. It's not going to be a mass exodus immediately, but I think the core perception of corporate America in the NFL will be interesting to keep an eye on. And let me get back to you real quick. Before we get to the specifics of the 49ers, both off the field and on the field, we had an interesting development yesterday. There's a coalition of 17 battered women's shelters here in the Bay Area. They've asked the 49ers to bench Ray McDonald until there's more clarity on what happened with his alleged domestic abuse case. The Niners have not responded to that publicly. Wondering what you think about that, Ann, if you think we're going to see more of that kind of call for action, or whether the NFL won't respond to that.
Well, the NFL is responding to calls for action. You know, as we saw, Roger Goodell picked a panel of women to help him on this issue. He's like in full damage control. The 49ers just have turtled up and pulled their head into their shell. I've talked to two different very key groups in Silicon Valley that deal with domestic violence. Both of them have reached out to the 49ers, offering their services, asking, you know, what they can do to be of assistance to help them get through this, and they didn't get any response. So I think that, you know, back to what we were talking about in terms of the corporate sponsorship, you know, these teams present themselves as partners within the community and pillars of the community, and I think that if they are not going to enlist the support of key groups within their community, that's not a good sign. And I got to wonder, what does Levi's think? You know, what does Levi's make? Levi's makes clothes. Who buys clothes for the most part? Women. I mean, I can't imagine that they're super thrilled that this is, you know, they've paid for this enormous sponsorship for this stadium, and now their brand has been sullied somewhat. So I think that, you know, the 49ers aren't responding to them right now publicly, and from what I've heard, they haven't responded privately, but I think they probably should. I think it would serve them well to kind of get involved and get ahead of this issue.
Yeah,
good point, Anna. The team is hiding behind the idea of due process still, and you know, there's an argument on that side, but it feels like the consensus from outsiders, people that aren't hardcore fans, are that they're looking for the Niners to take action in some form. What do you think on this, Scott?
Well, you know how Roger Goodell appointed 3 women to be his crisis team, or whatever you want to call it, for the NFL to deal with this kind of thing and to advise the league. And there are a lot of people, and maybe they're a little cynical, that were saying, oh, the only reason he did this, he's desperate to keep his job, it's spin control. And it probably is. But regardless, the fact is the NFL has responded by hiring 3 apparently very knowledgeable, very tough, very plugged-in women who know all about domestic violence to advise and counsel the league. And that, to me, is a huge positive, because I get the impression these women aren't going to be, you're not going to be able to kind of buy them off and the league can't shape them or anything. They're going to have their say, and I think it's a strong move by the league. Now, I think the 49ers could do something similar. They could reach out. There's plenty of people in the Bay Area that deal with this thing, this kind of stuff, as Ann said, and the 49ers could do a similar thing. They could hire 2 or 3 women that would be kind of an advisory thing. Because right now, like Ann said, it's like the 49ers either can't hear people or don't care about people. And part of the problem is that Jed York, for all the positives, he built the stadium and the things he's done, he's not a strong frontman presence. And certainly in this deal we're going through now, he has not been a strong presence. He finally came out and said some stuff, but he's left a very, very strong impression that Jed York is not dictating domestic abuse policy with the 49ers. Jed York is not setting the agenda for the team. It's Jim Harbaugh. He's assigned Jim Harbaugh to do that, and it's just a bad look. So that's what I think 49ers need to do. I think they need to get outside help, and they need to have somebody in their organization who can speak publicly to the community in a real voice about what's going on.
That's a great point, and Ann's brought that up in a number of her columns in the San Francisco Chronicle. She's discussed the lack of public leadership in a way about, you know, specifically about Jed York, but they've left Jim Harbaugh out front of the organization to answer these questions, to take the daily questions from the media, and he's done an okay job with it. We all know that he's not a big fan of expanding in any great length on most any topic, but Jim Harbaugh has been the face of this. Before we go further, I just want to remind our viewers here, this is the San Francisco Chronicle and SF Gate in partnership doing a Google Hangout with columnists Ann Killion and Scott Ostler from the San Francisco Chronicle. My name is Al Sarasovic. I'm the sports editor here, and if our readers have any questions and our viewers today on this Hangout, please send us a tweet. Mention us at SF Gate or # SF Gate. we have one question here from my colleague here on social media, and this is from Liz, I believe. Why don't we direct this to Ann? I think you're up next. But since Goodell has seemingly survived this scandal so far, what will it take for him to be forced out? Ann, is there any scenario that Roger Goodell loses his job?
Yeah, I think that there is a scenario, and I wouldn't have said that a couple of weeks ago. The guy oversees a $10 billion business, and he makes $44 million a year. And since he's become commissioner, the league has just expanded. You know, he's made so much money for people, but he has a credibility issue. And if you're the face of a league, you need to have credibility. That's really your first job, is to have credibility when you're negotiating deals, when you're talking to sponsors, when you're talking to the public. And I think he's taken a real hit. And I would disagree with the participant with the question, because I don't think we don't know if he survived. I mean, we're in the middle of this. This is ongoing. As rapidly as everything changes with social media, this is still an ongoing thing. And I think, you know, with this news about sponsors right now, that's going to be what could get him. I mean, if sponsors really say, look, you guys need to make a change, or we're not going to bankroll, you know, your league anymore, which is basically what Budweiser and Nike do, then he'll for sure be out. But you know, I know that the owners like him, and I know that he's made them a lot of money. So, and the owners, as we're finding out, not just here in town but around the league, they're not super courageous. They're not really ones to stand up and take a stand. So, you know, they might like Roger taking all the flack for them.
Also, the owners, I keep reading comments from individual owners saying, no, we support Roger Goodell 1,000%. That looks good. And is that lemonade?
It's sparkling water.
Okay. I keep seeing that there's support from all these different owners for Roger Goodell. And I think part of that is because there's a certain amount of sucking up. You don't want to get on Roger's bad side if you're an owner. You want to have him on your side. So I think that's part of it. They want to be teacher's pet. And I think what could bring Roger Goodell down is the investigation that they've launched with this former FBI director. Although it sounds kind of shaky, the guy really has strong ties. The investigator has strong ties with the league, and the guys that are helping him are two owners who are close with the league and close with Goodell. And so it's a kind of a shaky investigation. But if this investigator turns up evidence that Roger Goodell has been lying to us, just flat out lying about knowing this video was in the house and seeing it, I think that's going to be a major hit. I think that maybe that's when sponsors and other people clamor and say we don't want an NFL with an owner who's basically a lying sack, which is what he would be if it turns out to be.
Glad you finished the sentence right at that, Scott. But yeah, I agree with you and a lot of what Ann said there. First off, who's going to fire a guy who got $1.4 billion for the Buffalo Bills? I think the owners are still very much in Goodell's corner. But then, you know, the conversation will then pivot into a Watergate kind of thing about what did Roger Goodell know and when did he know it. If he saw this tape and that comes out as a proven fact and he has lied to the public over and over again, I do think you're going to have the erosion of trust that Ann Killion talked about, and possibly push from the sponsorship to get rid of him. I would imagine that the owners will keep a public front for as long as possible on this, but I can also not imagine that there's not phone calls going on in the background here and coalitions created amongst owners as to who's really going to be the old guard that stands behind Roger Goodell and who might be interested in making a change. I believe we have another question coming from our viewership, our readership. Thank you so much. Here on the SF Chronicle Google Hangout, discussing the NFL. From viewer Pete, should Congress be involved in the NFL's business? Start with you again, Al. Ann, is this a congressional issue?
Well, you know, what is their tax status? The NFL does not pay taxes. Is that correct? They operate as a nonprofit entity, or I'm not sure how that works, but I do know that there is, you know, with any giant national operation that has franchises in all across the country, yeah, Congress can get involved, and Congress can investigate. They already investigated with the brain trauma panel, and which is where Goodell lost a lot of credibility. Then he isn't on good standing with Congress right now. But yeah, I mean, sure, Congress can investigate anything.
I would say, in these kind of matters, anytime you hear Congress is about to step in, I kind of cringe. Not because I hate government or anything, but it seems like a lot of times it's just a showmanship thing and just a pandering. And in this case, I don't see, is Congress going to step in and say, okay, we're going to pass laws to tell the NFL who they have to suspend and not suspend? Because if they can do that to the NFL, they could do that to the Chronicle. They could pass laws saying if Scott Ostler is arrested for jaywalking, you have to suspend him. And this is kind of, do we really need government telling us that? To me, it's a company-by-company thing. I don't know if the NFL is any less enlightened than Acme Plumbing. I don't know. Just I think it would be a bad idea. And maybe local governments could get involved, because these teams are really, a lot of them are sort of public subsidies, because in a lot of cases the public money helps buy stadiums, finance policing on game days. The actual government, local governments, put a lot of money into these teams and basically subsidize them. So they should have some say, I would think.
They certainly did in Santa Clara. $1.3 billion stadium opened for the Niners this past weekend for the home opener. It was a disappointing loss to the Bears, 28-20. But what should have been a glorious day for the team, instead they found themselves caught under a shroud of this controversy over the NFL. You wrote about this on Sunday, and was the domestic abuse issue, did that take away from the home opener for the Niners? Do you think the crowd was different? What were your impressions of those two issues overlapping?
Well, the crowd is the crowd, right? They're highly invested. There's 67,000 people who, are spending their hard-earned money to be there and are by and large raving fans, and so there are a lot of the ones who don't want to hear about this. They're the people who would rather not deal with the unpleasant side of sports because they're hardcore fans. I think that it hurt them in that it was a nationally televised game and it was discussed, and they're like right in the eye of the hurricane here, and it became a talking point both in the pregame and the postgame, throughout the game. I know a lot of national writers were there both because of the stadium, but also because of this issue. And, some drew direct parallels between a team being undisciplined off the field to being undisciplined on the field with all those penalties. So, yeah, I mean, it was not the proud moment. It should have been the proudest moment in franchise history, or at least in recent franchise history, opening finally your stadium that you've been trying to get built for so long. And it definitely was not as shining a moment as they would have wanted.
Yeah, I agree. I think if a team ever desperately needed a win, it was the 49ers Sunday night. Opening in their new stadium, they want to prove that they can win there, first of all. And also, if they had pulled that game out, it would have just shoved all the talk about Ray McDonald and everything off to the side. But as it was, everybody was bummed out, and so just that contributed to the whole pall over the team. But yeah, I agree. Basically, fans get to the stadium, they don't care. Plus, a lot of the fans, especially at this new stadium, it's kind of the power elite. These are the rich, powerful people in San Francisco and Silicon Valley and everything. And a lot of them are probably looking at this whole thing saying, we're kind of on the 49ers side. We don't want people telling us how to handle our in-house cases. So maybe there's a lot of support for the 49ers in that respect.
That's an interesting point. I haven't thought about the libertarian angle with the Silicon Valley folks who definitely want government out of their backyards, and probably the same way the Niners are feeling right now. Why don't we've kind of covered the national big topics for the NFL. We got an interesting question from Dan via Twitter. He's one of our viewers and readers. here on the Chronicle's Google Hangout regarding the NFL. Joining me are Ann Killion, one of our columnists here at the Sporting Green, and Scott Ostler, one of her colleagues and a fellow columnist. I'm Al Zarasovic, the sports editor here. Dan asks, any likelihood of more transparency and work on the domestic violence issue at the collegiate level? And, that's a pretty good question, because a lot of this is learned behavior, and a lot of this is bad behavior that was forgiven at a certain point earlier in a player's career. Ann, we'll start with you again. Do you feel like we could see better behavior or better counseling on the college level?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the great things about this issue is that it has really brought it to the forefront. And people might not like that it's detracting from their enjoyment of sports, or might not like that it's maybe being sensationalized on social media. But I think it's really great that this issue is being talked about. The benefit of the Ray Rice video was that many, many people had never seen domestic violence, and they actually saw it and were horrified. And I think, yeah, this is kind of coinciding with the whole movement of, no means no on campuses, not just in the sports sector on campuses, but all across, because there's been so much concern about sexual assaults not being prosecuted on campuses, and that definitely overlaps with the sports world. We saw the Jameis Winston case last year, just totally mishandled by the Tallahassee police, and really put the spotlight on that program in terms of how they forgive, and also the media that gave him the Heisman Trophy in the midst of all that. And I think it is learned behavior, and these guys have been getting excuses in big-time college programs. They get run the campus by and large, and regular rules don't apply to them. So I think that when a spotlight is on an issue, it filters down to all levels and I think that that's really important. I think this is a moment in time for domestic violence, and I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I completely agree on that, and I'm not a domestic violence expert, although I play one on Google. But I think that if you talk to some of these local women who run these shelters and so forth, they would say basically the more heat the better. The more we drag this stuff out in the open, the better. Man, it's been we've done a great job as a society hiding this stuff. I remember about probably 3 or 4 years ago, the Phillies were in town to play the Giants, and I forget the pitcher's name. I wish I could think of it. But on a Saturday night before a Sunday game, he and his wife were out, and they got into a beef on a street corner in front of a bar, and he slapped her around. And somebody recorded it on video and whatever, and he got arrested for domestic violence. And the next day he's at the ballpark, and we even interviewed him either before or after the game. And he actually pitched that day. I don't remember if he was a starting pitcher or a relief pitcher, but he pitched that day. And then the whole thing kind of went away, as a story. I don't remember reading much more about it, but I don't think that would happen now. I think if that happened now, we'd follow up on it. And I'll give you one more example. LaMichael James, who went to University of Oregon, I believe, and when he was in college, he was accused of beating up his girlfriend in some way, slapping her around, throwing her downstairs, whatever it was. And then he eventually got cleared of that, and then the 49ers picked him up. He became a 49er, recently cut. But this is, again, Jim Harbaugh's zero tolerance policy, and they picked up a guy who has this past. So.
Carlos Hyde has it as well. And Carlos Hyde at Ohio State got sat down for several games while he was being investigated. So he perhaps learned a lesson that, some guys in the NFL aren't getting, that if you are arrested or investigated, that's enough to take a timeout from football.
It's going to be really tough, though, to get colleges to crack down. Maybe social pressure will make them do it, but in general, it's if a top player is under suspicion for this, they want to get the guy back in action as soon as possible because the coach's job is on the line. So these guys are always going to get a measure of protection.
I would agree with you, Scott. I think there's a great opportunity for education, especially with the younger players in college, because they're not fully formed yet with their interactions with their partners in life. But at the same time, as long as NCAA football and basketball are big-time billion-dollar sport, I think you're going to see some of the same behavior you're seeing in the NFL and in Major League Baseball and in the NBA, which is when there's a lot of money on the table. unfortunately, some bad behavior is forgiven and ignored. So, but I agree with what Ann was saying, that this is to me like a nexus point where we're seeing. Much like in the same way as the gay rights fight and the domestic partners marriage debates, these social issues seem to rise up and create a critical mass, especially in this era of social media where things can really be discussed in kind of in a hive mentality. And I think we're seeing a different kind of social change and activism than what we might have seen 40, 50 years ago during the civil rights movement. I think these issues can be brought to the fore and actually dealt with, and I would like to think that positive reform can happen in a faster way now than maybe what we saw in the past. Let's see here. I think we have for maybe a couple more questions, and maybe we get out of the realm of the criminal court, and why don't we do some quick lightning round questions with Ann and Scott about the Niners and Raiders. Scott, we'll start with you. 2 questions. What went wrong with the Niners on Sunday when they blew that huge lead against the Bears? And the second question, how much longer is Dennis Allen going to have his job as head coach of the Raiders? What do you think?
Well, the first question is, what went wrong is a lot of it was, well, what didn't go wrong? The defense is not that strong right now. Defense is compromised because so many guys are out, injured, hurt. So there's not the fearsome, tough defense, which has always been the bedrock of the 49ers. Also, Colin Kaepernick had an off day. I don't think it was as disastrous or as bad as some people say, but he had a bad day. Combination in the NFL, there's not a lot of there's too much parity. You can't bring your B- game and expect to win. So I think that's what happened there. And as far as Dennis Allen keeping his job, I'm saying, and I could be wrong, I've been wrong before, that he'll be gone assuming they're 0-4 after 4 games, because their 4th game is in London, and then there's a bye week following that's the point where Mark Davis will step in and say, you're out of here.
Let me go over to Ann real quick and ask her 2 questions. How much is the Aldon Smith suspension? Here's another 49er with criminal problems, both automatic weapons charges. He had DUI. How much is his 9-game suspension right now going to impact this Niners season? And for a Raiders question, does Reggie McKenzie go out the door as well with Dennis Allen? Reggie being the GM of the Raiders.
Well, Alton's. I mean, you could see how much it impacted them on Sunday night. I mean, they had no pass rush. They couldn't. Cutler had all the time in the world, and so the Aldon Smith thing is huge. Large part, it's the reason that the 49ers are not willing to do anything about Ray McDonald is because they don't have Aldon Smith for 9 games. He is a huge part of their defense. He is incredibly talented, and they're, for all the talk about next man up, there's nobody like him to replace him. So, 9 games is a really, really long time, and the 49ers already are in a hole in the NFC West. So, and in terms of Reggie, I got to say, I mean, I don't like firing people, but I got to say, if Dennis goes, I think Reggie has to go because he hasn't given, this is not a good team. It's just not a good team. Last year's draft was a complete disaster when it had to be good. The quarterback thing continues to be weird. Like they've twice gone out and signed guys and they haven't taken the job. So, I know that Mark Davis is very close to Reggie and trusts him, but it might be time to start over. And boy, that's a long plane ride from London.
In a fair world, I think Reggie should go before Dennis.
I would agree with that. When you think about what Reggie, what was that?
I think they're joined at the hip.
It's a good point, and I think Mark Davis is growing increasingly frustrated. Reggie McKenzie, I believe, had the largest offseason cap spaces in NFL history to sign free agents. It was a lousy season to do that. As usual, the Raiders didn't have any good luck in that, but he did not bring in a class of free agents or a class of draft picks in the last 2-3 years that gave Dennis Allen a whole lot to work with. So I do think we might be seeing some overhaul on the Raiders front. And on the Niners, defensive line struggles might be exacerbated this week. Eric Branch, the Chronicle's beat writer, reporting today that yet another cornerback might be out. I think it's Tremaine Brock, who was hurt worse than expected. So they're really thin at D-back. And if you don't have a pass rush and your cornerbacks are inexperienced, I think you're going to see more of what we saw with the Chicago Bears last Sunday night. They were able to pick apart the secondary. If an NFL quarterback has time, they'll find the open receiver. So I think Jim Harbaugh has his hands full trying to find some defensive secondary help, and he also has his hands full addressing the very serious questions of domestic abuse and violence in the NFL, which seem to be a never-ending scandal for the league right now. So we'll keep covering the story here at the SF Chronicle and SF Gate. I wanted to thank Ann Killion and Scott Ostler, two of our columnists here at the Sporting Green, and I wanted to thank all of our viewers and readers for joining us for today's Google Hangout on the NFL. Thank you and take care.